Quotation from myself, segment 93, quotation number 1079. Whatever it may be, whether absolutely essentially or totally frivolous, there seems to be never enough of it in any group or society for everyone to get the equal share of it. And so those with discretionary power to give or to withhold practice forever the subtle art of figuring out who could be overlooked with the greatest impunity. 1080. No matter how wise some precepts are, even greater wisdom is required not to carry them to the extreme. The unexamined life is not worth living. It's certainly a kind of warning anyone could, by heeding it, benefit from. Yet too much introspection clearly could be detrimental to one's mental, eventually physical health. And some individual has managed to wreck their lives completely by making self-analysis its main preoccupation. By concentrating excessively on the inner and not so inner self, they gradually lost the vital connection with the outside world. But since, contrary to modern psychology, what is without and not what is within, that our personal well-being depends on, one usually disregards it at one's peril. 1081. It must be one of those strange paradoxes life apparently is so full of, that the more one tells about himself, either in speech or in writing, the more mysterious he seems to be to his reader and listeners. And if each personal statement, no matter how sincere it is, only arouses more bewilderment and calls for more questions. For example, while listening to yet another self-revealing poet, one can't help but to feel this nagging suspicion, more likely than not unjustified, that the sincerity and openness of such poetry is rather selective, and that much more has been left out than was actually said. On the other hand, and here lies the paradox, the poets who would rather write about anything but themselves appear to be much less of a puzzle for the listeners. There are several possible explanations of this phenomenon. One is that whatever we say, poets and not poets alike, about ourselves is going unavoidably to be taken out of context of our whole life and being. And the greater our personal outpouring is, the less the sheer quantity, complexity, and inevitable inconsistency of it all makes sense to the listeners. And again, conversely, to understand those who hardly disclose anything personal seems so much easier. Another explanation is that we all, but especially the poets, tend to overestimate our abilities for self-perception and don't realize that, contrary to the popular notion, we reveal much more about ourselves while talking just about anything else. 1082. Unbeknownst to them, the ethnic minorities perform very important therapeutic service to the dominant majority by enhancing and maintaining its psychological well-being. For since the ethnic minority never seems to be able to fully assimilate, at least in the eyes of ever-watched majority, and therefore are never up to its cultural and linguistic standards, they are always viewed by the majority as somewhat deficient, and thus provided with a sense of superiority, our species apparently in such a need of to sustain so much wanted and yet ever flagging even among the most arrogant nations, self-esteem. 1083. We all feel somewhat guilty when not listening to those who try to tell us something, and when in reverse situation are more or less miffed or even angry if it is us who are not being listened to. And yet, understandable emotional reaction aside, most of the time it is hardly the fault of a listener if he is not paying enough attention to a speaker, but must be that of the speaker, who has nobody to blame but himself for not being sufficiently interesting to warrant the undivided attention of the listener. Of course, quite often, out of politeness or a sense of social obligation, one forces himself to listen to the most boring or irrelevant speech, but this is nothing but a self-violation. It is better for all concerned, if possible, to interrupt such speech, and if not, to leave. As Hamlet said, I must be cruel only to be kind. And so are you, by refusing to listen to what, in your opinion, is not worth listening to. For you are actually doing the speaker a favor, albeit in an admittedly cruel manner, by showing him that the next time he better come up with something more engaging, not only to him, but to somebody else. And he probably will. 1084. One of the most important socio-economic trends of our time is the rapidly increasing, due to the ever-accelerating speed of technological innovation, division of labor, which forces on a much grander scale than ever before in history more and more people to spend their entire lives doing things they, given a choice, would rather not to do. But since for the overwhelming majority of the working people such a choice is but a luxury they can never afford in order to survive, they must, no matter how dreadful their jobs are, do them. Which lead to the unparalleled hitherto level of mass unhappiness and frustration, especially in the developed world, where this division of labor has reached its highest degree. In response to this social problem, a totally new field of modern psychology has developed recently to help all these chronically unhappy and frustrated workers to accept the unacceptable and to reconcile to the unreconcilable. And the claim and the promise of this new breed of psychologists is that these people could be taught how to go on doing what they hate to do, with less aversion and hopefully with greater satisfaction, and what is the most important for a capitalist system, which is the true hidden force behind this psychological innovation, with ever greater productivity. And yet the call to accept something detestable, and maybe even to learn to enjoy it, isn't such a new idea after all, since it also used to be suggested to rape victims not so long time ago. For isn't being forced to do your entire life something you hate to do the worst kind of rape? And instead of treating the casualty of the socio-economic war only to return them back to the trenches, psychologists would do much greater service to humanity by using their considerable expertise to help the rest of us to abolish the war itself. 1085. If one wants to preserve one's sanity, one has no other choice but to accept the world as it is and the people in it as they are. 1086. How true the saying that none so deaf as those who won't hear must be. For no matter how sensible or cogent your arguments are, the person you are trying to convince will never give free consent to them if he believes that agreeing with you could be detrimental to his interests. And it is not because such thing as an objective and impartial truth does not exist. It does. The problem arises from the fact that the majority of men and women will categorically reject it if they perceive it to be harmful to them. 1087. It is unreasonable, even foolish, to expect a whore in bed to turn into a nun in a jewelry store. 1088. Lacking the essential fighting and survival skills like egotism, deceitfulness, guile, treachery, callousness, malice, vindictiveness, greed, and ambition, the upright man has no other choice but to find life through faith. For he almost certainly, as a result of such an obvious social handicap, will have very little else but his faithfulness. 1089. Any socio-economic system, no matter how ostensibly fair it appears to be, would justify the difference in the material rewards by the alleged differences in the personal abilities and merits, will inevitably and very quickly deteriorate into one in which the apparently superior few will consume the lion's share of common goods, while the supposedly inferior many will be reduced to spend their entire lives in a perpetual poverty. But if one acknowledges as self-evident that as far as our appetites are concerned, there is essentially no difference between one human being and another, how can any society that disregards this obvious fact of nature by providing the condition for the inevitable economic inequality be called just? 1090. It is infinitely easier to dispose of what one already possesses than to get it when one suddenly is in a dire need of it. 1091. Here is one example in support of this proverbial notion that the extremes myth. Take someone for whom the primary consideration in whatsoever he/she does is to get what he/she wants, regardless of what anybody thinks about him or her. Then take another person who is completely opposite to the first one, that is, whatever he/she does, the most important thing for him/her is a good opinion of the others, and he/she would rather act to please them than him or herself. Now, when such extremes meet, the relations between those two opposite types can work out quite well, and the pattern of it is more or less predictable. For the first type will always get what he/she wants by playing on the overwhelming need of the second one to be always thought well of, and the second type will invariably sacrifice his/her desires when threatened with disapproval of the first. And such a relationship, no matter how one-sided and unfair it obviously is, can nevertheless last for a long, long time, though it doesn't mean that it is a happy one.